Hi everyone. In this third video for this week, I want to talk with you about another of the aspects, the 7 aspects of the first sign in John's Gospel. And that aspect is the significance of the sign. If meaning is what a sign reveals or unveils about Jesus, or at least what it has the potential to reveal or unveil, significance is the way in which that potential is realized. It is what a sign actualizes, what it does or doesn't reveal or unveil to an audience in terms of perception, understanding, and response. So in John's Gospel, different portions of the audience of a sign perceive that a sign has or has not taken place. And different portions of the audience often understand or don't understand the sign. They see or don't see. They hear or don't hear what it reveals. And different portions of the audience respond to it in different degrees, either positively or negatively or simply in an ambiguous way. The significance of the first sign makes all of this clear. Let me show you how. Since it is the first of many signs in John, it serves as a paradigm for understanding significance, the significance associated with all the other signs of Jesus in the book of signs. It shows us the way that a sign works for John. The significance of this first sign for John is conveyed to us in terms of what John says explicitly and what John implies in the third part of verse 11, where John writes these words, "And his disciples believed in him." The disciples perceive, at least partially and initially, what is revealed about Jesus as a result of the work he does as he changes water into wine. They understand that what happens to the water poured into the 6 stone purification jars is about more than just an unexplained, anomalous physical event when it becomes wine. They perceive, at least partially and initially, that it is a sign in the same way that God performs signs in the Old Testament. A sign which Jesus performs that reveals something more to John and his disciples about Jesus than they have known about him in their relationship with him prior to this point. The disciples perceive something new about Jesus' identity, Jesus' character, Jesus' power, and Jesus' relationship to the Father through this sign. The disciples gain a new understanding, and through that understanding, a new and different and fuller relationship with Jesus, a relationship characterized by John with the word believed. This is the fourth use of that word believe in John's Gospel. The first 2 occurrences are in the first part of chapter 1, in the prologue, where the narrator says Jesus came so that all people might believe through him. Then goes on a little later to talk about all who believe in his name. The third time the word believe occurs is found in the last part of chapter 1, when Jesus tells Nathanael he saw him under a fig tree before he saw him in person. And Nathanael responds, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." To which Jesus replies, "Because I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe?" And all 3 of these uses of the word believe provide the immediate literary context in the world inside the text of John to prepare us as readers to hear the first sign story in John chapter 2 and understand John's words when he writes in verse 11, "And his disciples believed in him." Intertextually, the connection between John chapter 1 and John chapter 2 a text between the connection between the text of John chapter 2 and the world inside the Gospel of John. That intertextuality shows us what Jesus means when at the end of the sign story he writes those words. John means that his disciples, Jesus' disciples, understood what Nathanael had understood earlier. They began to believe in his name as the Son of God and the King of Israel. But what the word John writes, his disciples believed in his name, does not tell us what his disciples understood by those titles, Son of God, King of Israel. It does not tell us what those titles meant to them at this point, in terms of the fullness of their meaning in relationship to Jesus' own self-understanding of those titles, Son of God, King of Israel. The question, then, is what does it mean to believe? And that question is one that John is vitally interested in. In fact, at the end of chapter 20, John will tell us that his account of the gospel was written for a specific purpose. The things that I've written, he tells us, these are written, and I'm quoting now, so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing, and John means believing in a continuing sense, you may have life in his name. That statement, like Jesus' question to Nathanael in chapter 1, because I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? Helps us understand from the start to the finish of the Gospel of John that believing in Jesus, or believing in his name, means not only coming to believe in an initial way, but continuing to believe in a way that continues to deepen perception of who Jesus is, understanding of who Jesus is, and knowledge of who Jesus is, so that a person's relationship with Jesus deepens. For example, Jesus tells Nicodemus in John chapter 3, you must be born again, using a metaphor that shows that belief has a life, like a human life. Belief begins with a new birth from above, from the Spirit, not the flesh. And that new life that begins with a new birth needs to continue to develop and grow to maturity. But its growth can be stopped or stunted at any point. And if it is, it will not become a full, a mature, a complete belief. And it will not lead to the kind of full, complete, mature life in the way that it is intended to. Why? Because development in terms of perception, understanding, and response to Jesus is what enables a relationship with Jesus to grow into one of increasing trust and knowledge and love. When John writes in chapter 20, these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through continuing to believe, believing, you may have life in his name. John wants you and me to understand what it means to come to believe initially that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and to understand what it means to continue to believe, what believing means. Believing is how John understands we grow up into more and more of the life and the relationship with God through Jesus that God intends for us to find. John wants us to begin to understand believing in Jesus, believing in his names, Son of God, and all of his other titles. John wants us to come to understand continuing to believe in this way, because this kind of continuing belief that follows initial belief is the way that Jesus understands belief. And John wants us to respond to different stages of belief as Jesus does, as we begin to see him do here and in the rest of chapter 2, and throughout the continuing signs in the book of signs. Now, with that said, we also need to think for a moment about what John's words and his disciples believed in him tell us implicitly about the other people who are part of the audience in this first sign story. About them, John says nothing, but his telling of the story implies a range of responses. And once again, intertextuality in John's gospel, in the world inside the text, can help us see what John implies. Remember that in another part of the prologue of John, a different part than the one I just mentioned to you a few moments before, in this part of the prologue, John writes, Jesus came to his own home, and his own people received him not. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave them power to become children of God. So to believe in terms of John's understanding means more than simply to know. For the servants knew where the wine came from, but John implies that that knowledge in and of itself did not lead them to the same kind of response and belief as the disciples, who perceived what Jesus had done as a sign, an act that began to reveal and unveil to them his glory as of the only Son from the Father. The supervisor of the feast is an example of another kind of response. For while he experiences the effects of the sign, he doesn't know where the wine comes from. For him, it is an unexplained anomaly. But an even more intriguing question concerns the kind of belief Mary seems to demonstrate in Jesus in the surrounding text before the sign itself occurs. And we'll talk about that in the next video as we talk about the surroundings of this sign story in John chapter 2.